In the second episode of this tutorial series, we'll be modeling the stone base that supports our magic portal. We'll also be learning about modifiers, modeling techniques, and more as we build out our scene. If you find yourself enjoying this tutorial, consider checking out my premium classes on Skillshare. I'm excited that I can offer everyone a completely free month of premium Skillshare membership by using the link in the description and comments below. I have 9 unique classes focused on many different aspects of Blender, such as my Model a Low Poly Fantasy Sword class. With that out of the way, let's proceed with the tutorial. We're going to start with learning a little bit about the anatomy of a 3D model. This will help you understand the different parts of a 3D model and how we can manipulate them to create our desired object. If you're familiar with the concept of vertices, edges, and faces in Blender, feel free to skip ahead to the time listed here. We'll start by adding a cube to our scene. We'll hit Shift and A to bring up our Add menu, then go to Mesh and choose Cube. We can now move this cube off to the left side so we can get a better look at it. In order to actually manipulate the shape of our model without just scaling or rotating it, we need to enter Edit mode. We can enter Edit mode by hitting Tab on our keyboard. So we can hit Tab now, and we can see here it changes a little bit of our interface, and now it says up at the top, Edit mode. And now that we're in Edit mode, we can actually see the 3 parts that make up a model. Our vertices, edges, and faces. And we can switch between these modes here at the top left. You can also use the key 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard to switch between them as well. We'll start with vertices by hitting 1 on our keyboard to switch to vertex mode. Now let's zoom in on the cube. And I'm going to click off the cube, so I'm just going to click over here in this empty space to deselect. Because right now, by default, it started with everything already selected. The vertices are these tiny little black dots that we see on the corners of our cube. We can click on them and move them just like we can a normal object. But we can see as we move them, we're actually moving the corner of this cube and we're changing the shape of it as well. So we can move them in or out or up or down. We can also drag select over multiple pieces. So we can drag select over both of these vertices here, both corners, and move them simultaneously to change the shape a little bit more. Instead of drag selecting, we can also select a single vertice and then hold down Shift and select another vertice to add to the selection, and that will select both of them at the same time. By default, if we just select a vertice and then we select another one without holding down Shift, it will deselect the original and now just select the new one. So I can click on this and then move it back in line so it's a little bit more square. So each set of vertices is connected together by an edge. And we can switch to our edge mode by hitting 2 on our keyboard. And now we can see these black dots have disappeared, but now we have black lines connecting where the black dots used to be. Every edge that we select is the line between 2 vertices. So if we select this, we can move it. We can also use things like rotate, so we can rotate this edge, or we can hit S to scale it, and we can scale the edge as well. And then lastly, we have faces, which is 3 on our keyboard to switch to face mode. And faces are the areas between the edges and the vertices. So there are actually these large gray squares that we're seeing here. So if we select this, this will select the entire face. And a face has to be made up of at least 3 vertices. If it only had two vertices here, it would essentially just be a line. However, if this was a triangle, we would still have a face in the middle here. And faces work just like the others. We can move them, we can rotate them, or we can scale them. When you're done editing your model, you can hit Tab to exit the edit mode. And now you're back in object mode, which allows you to just move the entire object without having to grab individual pieces of it. Now that we know a little bit about what a model is made of, we can delete this test cube. So we can hit either delete or X on your keyboard. With that crash course out of the way, let's move on to actually creating the base of our portal. We'll start by adding a brand new cube. So we're going to hit Shift and A, then go to Mesh, and choose Cube. Now before we do anything to this cube, we do want to change some of the settings, namely the size. Right now it's much too large for this, so we're going to make it a lot smaller. So we'll go down here to the size, we're just going to type in 0.5 and then hit enter. And that'll make a cube a lot smaller to start with. With the size changed, we can now go up here to our list where it says cube. We're going to double click on this. We're going to rename it portal base and then hit enter. So we're going to move it off to the left side here, which is the negative X direction. And we can tell that it's the negative direction because the arrow is actually pointing the opposite direction. So it's pointing to the right, which means this is going positive, and this side, the left side, is moving negative. And we can also tell, but up here, if we look at this little gizmo up here, this gives us an idea of which direction all of these axes are facing. So if we hover over this little tiny bubble here, we can see that it says negative X. So the left side is our negative side. So make sure you're moving it in the negative X direction. And we're going to move it far enough to the left that it has a little bit of an air gap between the cube itself as well as the outside of this portal. So we're just going to move it. It doesn't have to be a perfect amount. We just want to have a bit of a gap between them. We don't want them touching. Now that the cube is moved to the left, we can also move it down. So we're going to move it down in the negative Z direction. So we're going to grab this blue handle and then pull it down so that this little red line starts poking through the top. And this red line here lines up directly with the middle of our portal. So essentially we're just placing the top of this cube right at the midpoint of our portal. We're going to be manipulating this cube into a half circle stone ring for the bottom of our portal. This will act as a sort of base for our portal ring. To make this process a bit easier, we're going to be using a new modifier called mirror. So let's start by adding the mirror modifier. Go over here to your modifier tab, this little blue wrench icon on the right. Click add modifier. And then in the second list here, it's about halfway down, we're going to choose mirror. Now let's zoom out a little bit. And we'll notice right away that it didn't really do anything. And that's because the cube is actually mirroring directly on top of itself. So by default, the mirror modifier is going to use this little tiny orange dot for this cube, which is called the origin, and it's going to mirror from there. So since that orange dot is directly in the center, it's essentially making a second cube directly on top of itself. Now luckily, there's a relatively easy way to change this. We're going to be choosing a new object as the source of the mirror. So instead of using this tiny little orange dot, the origin, we're going to tell it to use the portal itself as the center of the mirror. So we can go over here to where it says mirror object. We can click this tiny little eyedropper icon, and then we can click on our portal. And now when we do that, we can see that it's mirrored it across roughly the exact same distance. Now in reality, it is the exact same distance from the edge of the portal, but since the edge of the portal isn't consistent on both sides, it might appear a little bit closer on the right side than it is on the left. And then the last thing we need to do is just check this clipping box here. This will just ensure that the mirror modifier does what it's supposed to do when the objects meet up. It doesn't have any overlapping. The mirror modifier is making an exact duplicate of what it sees on the left side over here on the right side. Now right now it's not super obvious that these are mirrored, but once we start changing the shape of this, you'll notice that it's actually horizontally mirrored over here. So with our cube selected, now let's go into our edit mode and begin making changes. So we're going to hit tab to go into our edit mode. And then we're also going to enable something called X-ray mode. So before we enable it, I'm going to give you a quick example of exactly what X-ray mode actually does. So by default, if I deselect my cube, I'm just going to click off to the left side in this empty space. And then I drag select over top of it to select more faces. It looks like I'm selecting the entire cube. As far as I can tell, everything I'm seeing is orange. However, if I rotate my camera around, I notice the back side of this actually wasn't selected. And that's because from this angle in the viewport where we originally drag selected over it, you couldn't see those faces. And by default, it will not select through the model. It's only going to select what it sees. So if we click off this model to deselect and then hit Alt and Z to enable our X-ray mode, which can also be enabled up here, this little button here with these two overlapping squares. If we click that, that will also enable it. Now we can see through the model, so we're actually seeing kind of like a half opacity version of this model. And now if we drag select over top of it and then rotate around to the back, we'll notice that it's actually selected the entire thing. And that's because X-ray mode allows you not only to see through the model, but also select through the model. It's important to use X-ray mode when you're modeling, because without it, you might find yourself only moving one side of our model without realizing it, because you only selected what was visible. So in general, most of the time, unless there's a particularly good reason not to be, working in X-ray mode is almost always a benefit. And again, the keybind for that is Alt and Z at the same time. So just hold down Alt and then hit Z to flip in and out of your X-ray mode. Now hit 3 on your keyboard to make sure that you're in face mode. And then we're going to click the top of this cube here. We want to select it near the middle, so near where these little tiny dots are in the center. And this is something you'll only see when you're in X-ray mode. So you want to select near the tiny dot in the top of this face. And that will select the top of the face. Now let's scale this down to make this cube into a little bit more of a pyramid shape. So we're just going to hit S on our keyboard to start scaling. We're going to scale it down pretty small. We want it to be a relatively sharp cube. So around there. And again, this doesn't need to be perfect. Just kind of eye yours up and make sure that it looks pretty similar to mine. Now we're going to rotate our viewport down. So we're looking kind of towards the front of this, kind of straight down the middle of it. And we're just going to move this over to the side to make a slanted pyramid shape. So we want this face here to be pretty well flat, as close to flat as you can get it. And then this side here on the left is actually really slanted. So now if I quickly zoom out a little bit, you can see what I meant about it being mirrored. So since we moved this to the right side, the mirrored portion of this, created by the mirror modifier, is actually slanted to the left. This is important because it makes our model symmetrical. Now let's go back to the left side here. We're going to rotate our viewport down so that we can see the bottom of this pyramid. And then we're going to select this bottom face just by left clicking on it, somewhere near this dot. If you don't select near the dot, you'll actually select through the model sometimes, so you won't be selecting anything. In this X-ray mode, you need to select near the dots in order to select the faces. With this bottom face selected, now we can hit E on our keyboard to start the extrusion process. So E for extrusion. And what extruding means is basically just creating more geometry based on the face that you had just selected. So we're kind of lengthening this cube by adding more geometry in whatever direction that face was already pointing. So we're going to move this down to make it about twice as tall as it was. So essentially this smaller cube that we're making on the bottom should be about as tall as the top pyramid is as well. And we're going to be doing this exact same thing 2 more times. So let's zoom out a little bit. With this bottom face still selected, we're going to hit E, make another segment here at the bottom that's about as tall as the one just above it. These don't need to be perfect, just make it roughly the same. And then we're going to hit E one more time and make another segment that's about as tall as the other 2. So around there is good. So now I have 4 relatively equal segments, at least in terms of their height. The top one looks a little bit different, but these 3 on the bottom are all pretty similar. So now on the inside of this sort of pillar that we made, this bottom right area, we're going to select this face, so the inner face, and we're going to do the same sort of similar operation here, except we're only going to be doing it twice, so they're going to be a little bit more rectangular. So select this face, hit E to start extruding. We're going to move it out about half the distance, so maybe about here. And then we're going to hit E again to start extruding it again. And we're going to move it until we can't move it any further. And this is where that clipping setting that we checked on the modifier comes in. If we hadn't checked on clipping, we would have been able to move past this, and we would have actually had some overlapping geometry. So by turning clipping on, we just prevent that from happening. So we'll just move it until we can't move it any further, until it touches, and then we'll click. So now we have these 2 areas meeting, but we'll notice that there's still a face between them. And we want to get rid of that face so that this merge setting here will successfully weld these vertices together and make it all one contiguous mesh. Without this face deleted in the middle, it's actually kind of still technically 2 half pieces. So with this face still selected here in the middle, the one we just extruded, we're just going to hit X or delete on your keyboard. And then this will bring up a context menu regardless of which you pushed. So if you push delete or X, it's still going to bring this up. And we're going to choose delete faces. So we're actually going to delete the face that we just had selected. So now we have an open edge here, but that means that the mirror modifier is going to be able to actually weld these together into one like continuous mesh. With the basic shape completed, let's start shaping this stone base. Now let's go into our front view so we can get a better look at the shape overall. So when I say front view, I don't actually just mean kind of rotating your viewport until it's kind of in the front. There's actually a dedicated front view, and it's considered an orthographic view. So an orthographic view essentially is a completely flattened, you can almost think of it as like a blueprint view. So it's completely 2D. It's flattened everything out, and it makes your view perfectly from a specific direction. So front, left, right, top, bottom, any of the main directions you might think of. And there's two ways we can enter this front view. So the easiest way to do it is to go up here on this little gizmo here, and we're going to click on this the little bubble here that by default it has nothing in it, and that's because it's the negative version. But if you click over on top of this negative Y bubble, this will jump us into our front view. And I know it's specifically the front view because I can go up here to the top left and it says front orthographic view. And you can see this kind of has a blueprint look to it, especially with this grid in the background. And you can also see that it's perfectly from the front. I can't see any of the sides of this object because it's, dead center 100% from the front of the view. Now, an important thing about our front views is you can only zoom in and out and click in to pan your view. You cannot rotate in this view. The second you rotate in this view, it's going to pop you out of that view and back into what's called the perspective view, which is what we've been working in to begin with. So this is kind of the default view that we're working in here. And then the orthographic views are more utilitarian views. So again, you can just click this little negative Y bubble to jump into our front view, or the quicker keybind that if you want to get used to doing it this way is to hit either the tilde or the accent key, which is directly above your tab key and to the left of the 1 on the keyboard. So if you hit that, it's going to bring up a radial menu. And in this radial menu, you can choose from all the different views as well as a few different options down here. In our case, we just hover over the word front because that's the view we want. And we can click front and it'll hop us into that. So it's two different ways to do it. One's, a little bit more obvious and direct, and then the other one is kind of hidden behind a keybind, but it also has more views attached to it. Now that we're in our front view, we're going to switch to our vertex mode. So we're going to hit 1 on our keyboard to switch to vertex. And now we can begin shaping this and making it a little bit more U-shaped so that it follows the shape of the portal. So at this point, it's very important that you're in your X-ray mode. That's because we can't actually see both of the vertices that we want to select here. So we have to rely on the fact that if we drag select over top of them, it will select through the model and select the vertice that's directly behind this. If you weren't in X-ray mode, you'd only actually be selecting the front of this. So again, make sure you're in X-ray mode if you're not already. And now we're just going to be drag selecting over portions of the shape here and moving them inward to start matching this U shape. So I'm just going to drag select over this now that I've moved this one in, and I'm moving it only on the X direction, so just this red handle. So I'm just going to start moving these in so that they start mimicking the U shape of the bottom half of this portal. So now we'll notice down here at the bottom that this is actually clipping into the bottom of the portal, and that's fine. We can actually change that. So we're going to drag select over the middle portion here, and we're going to move these just downward instead. So we'll move this down. And now this set of vertices here, I'm going to drag select over them. And for this one, I'm actually going to just use this little green square, which will allow us to move it in both directions. So both the X and the Z. And I'm going to move this down so I make kind of a nice rounded bottom for this. I would just go through here and just kind of, fix this shape so that it matches this U shape as much as you can. I know there's not a lot to work with here, and that's fine. Just do the best that you can to match the shape of this U. If you find that the top portion of your portal is still a little too far away, or the portal ring rather, you can just drag select over the top of these points here and then move them in. Now you do have to be careful a little bit over here on this side. So if your portal's like mine, where it has a large indent here on this side, but it has a sort of a pop out on this side, make sure you don't move it in so far that it's not touching on the left side, but it is touching on the right side. You still want it to be good on both sides. So if it means one side is a little bit further away than the other, that's okay. Just make sure it's not touching. I'll move mine to maybe about here. So it might have moved in a little bit, but overall it's not too much further away. So now that we're pretty happy with the inside shape of this, let's start shaping the outside as well. So to start with, I'm going to move this one in a little bit. I'm going to sort of taper this on the edge. I'm going to leave this set of vertices where they're at. And then instead, I'm just going to grab the bottom two here. So I can select over multiple ones. So if I select over both of these set of vertices, I'll move them both at the same time. And I'm going to move these in just a little bit. So you can see what that does. It just adds a little bit more character to the outside of it. It's not quite so flat. It kind of starts out flat, bows outward to make this kind of, horn shaped or spike pillar on the left side, as well as the right side because of the mirror. And then on this side, it's just kind of curving around to make sure that it doesn't touch the portal at all. I'm sure you noticed as you were shaping this that you didn't really have a whole lot of vertices to work with. So there were some concessions that you had to make in certain areas because you just didn't have a vertice to move in those. So let's start by adding in some more cuts so we have more vertices to play with. We'll start down here at the bottom. We're going to hit Control R while hovering over the bottom lines here. So these vertical lines here, they're not quite so vertical now that we've moved them, but they're more vertical than they are horizontal. So we're going to hover over these and just hit Control R. And you'll see right away it pops up this yellow line. So this is just telling you where you're going to be placing the cut. So if you move your mouse around without doing anything else, it's just moving where this cut's going to be placed. So in our case, we want to place it so that the yellow line is going horizontally across these faces at the bottom. Once we've chosen the location we want, we just click once, and that will start placing the cut. However, we do have the ability to move this cut before we place it permanently where it's going to be. So let's move this up a little bit. We're just going to slide it up. We're going to place it up near the top. So about this far away from the top vertice there. So once we decide where we want it, we can just click again, and that will cement the cut in place. So by cutting this, we've actually added more vertices for us to move around. We'll also notice though that this cut has kind of mimicked the shape of this line here. So it starts out flat and then it kind of curves down. Now if we want to flatten this out, so in this case we want this to be a perfectly flat line, kind of like the bottom of this portal base. We're going to have to scale this flat. So with these vertices still selected, and if you, for some reason, if you unselected these by accident by maybe clicking somewhere else, an easy way to reselect these would be just to hold down Shift and then drag select over each part. So I'm going to just drag select over these two, then I can just drag select over this, and then drag select over that. So now I've successfully reselected that entire line. So now let's scale this completely flat in the Z direction. So we're going to hit S to start scaling, then Z to bind it to just the up and down axis. And we could try to kind of make it flat if we wanted to, but you can see it's a little bit harder than it should be. So if we wanted to make it perfectly flat, we're going to scale this to 0, which is essentially completely smashed down, completely squished flat. So we hit S, then we hit Z, so it's bound to Z. Now we can hit 0, and that will bind it to, or that will squish it down to 0 scale essentially. And then we can hit enter. So now we have a perfectly flat line by hitting S, Z, and then 0. Now let's move this down a little bit. We're going to move it so that there's a little bit of a gap here still between this lowest point of the portal base and this line we just created. Now let's use these new vertices here that we just created on the outside to make the bottom of this a little bit more interesting. We're just going to drag select over both of these vertices here, so both top and bottom here, and we're going to move them out to make a little bit more of an interesting base on the outside. So we'll move this out to about here. So now it moves down, kind of comes in a little bit, and then it kicks back out and flares at the bottom. Before adding any more cuts, let's fix these really slanted edges that we just made by adding this cut in begin with. So again, we're just going to drag select over the areas that we want to flatten out. In this case, we have to flatten each line by itself. If we selected both of these at the same time and then tried to flatten, we would actually squish them together. So we need to do them individually. So I'm going to select just these two here. And now I'm going to hit S and then X in this case because I need to squish it in the left and right direction, which in this case is X. And then I'm going to hit 0. to completely squish it and make it flat, and then hit enter. Now I can move this over so that it's pretty much in line with this vertex here. I don't need to worry about these being exactly perfectly flat. I just need it to be flatter than it was before. And now let's do this one more time. We're going to drag select over these vertices instead. Hit S, then X, and then 0 to flatten them out. Hit enter to confirm that, and then we're just going to move it so that it's pretty much in line with the one above it as well. Now that we've cleaned the bottom up, let's add a few more cuts on these columns here, these pillars on the left and right side, so that we can make the pillars a little bit more interesting than they currently are. So we're going to hit Control and R while hovering over this pillar here on one of these horizontal lines. And we can see it brings up our yellow line, and we want this yellow line to go up and down the pillar just like it is now. So once we have that yellow line, we can click, and then we don't actually want to slide this left or right at all. We want it basically in the middle. So I'm going to put it right back in the middle again. And we can see that it actually, that little yellow kind of highlight we're seeing, that shows us where the middle is. So right as it flips left and right, that's generally where the middle is at. So we can just place it near the middle. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then we're going to click again so that it's nice in the center. Now before we do anything with these cuts, we are going to rotate out of our front view just by rotating our viewport so that we can see our perspective view again. And now we're going to hover over the side of this, so like the side of this U shape that we just made. And we're going to hit Control and R, so we can do it down here at the bottom. It doesn't really matter as long as we're on this side. So we can see now we're making a yellow line that goes around the U on the edges. So we want the cut to look like this. And then once we have it there, we can click. And then we can just click one more time so that it doesn't move left or right at all. It's just going to put it right in the center again. So now we've made a set of cuts that go around it this direction, as well as around it this direction. Now let's start making these pillars a little bit more interesting. Right now they're pretty flat, so let's give them some dimension in this direction. So we're just going to rotate around so we can see the front view here. We don't have to go into the actual front view. This won't be that particular. So we're just going to rotate around, so we're kind of looking down the middle of the front of the column here. And then we're just going to drag select over these vertices here. We don't want to select the very top. We only want the vertices that start just below from the top of the column. And now with these selected, we're going to hold down Shift and select these down here as well, because we want to add to the selection. If we had just reselected down here at the bottom by dragging and not holding Shift, we would have lost the original selection. Okay, so now we have everything here selected, everything basically going around except for the very top. And we're going to be scaling these up in the Y direction to make the column a little bit wider this direction. So now let's just rotate around to the side so we can get a better view. And then we're going to hit S and then Y to make sure we're only scaling it in the Y direction. And we're just going to scale it up a little bit. So around here, you can see down here at the bottom left, if your little box popped up, mine is roughly 0.36, 0.37 wider. So down here, and basically we're just giving this column a little bit of a rounding shape to it. Now let's make this rounding a little bit more obvious just on the bottom. So to do this, we're going to go back down to our sort of pseudo front view. We're going to hold down Control, and then we're going to drag select over the topmost vertices here. So now we've limited our selection one further down than it was. And you'll notice that by holding Control and dragging over something, it's the opposite of what Shift does. So Shift makes sure it adds to the selection. Holding Control makes sure you remove from the selection. So we've removed this selection at the top. So now we just have this kind of bottom half of the pillar selected. And we're going to again scale this up a little bit further. So we'll hit S, then Y, and we're going to scale this out a little bit more to make it even more tapered. So we're kind of making a cone shape here. Okay. And down here at the bottom left, you can see it was roughly maybe 0.3 roughly is where I scaled it up to. And then one last time, we're going to do that same thing again. This time we're going to hold Control and deselect this top vertex here, as well as the one just below it. So we're deselecting these top two rows of vertices. so that we only have the very bottom two selected. And then we're going to hit S and then Y, and then scale these up. So we're again further flaring the bottom of this column out. And we'll scale it up to about here. In my case, about 1.45, 1.5 roughly. Now let's rotate around to the front. And we'll notice that while the edges here are getting more round, getting them a little bit more interesting, this front area is also really flat still. So let's fix that. So I'm going to rotate my camera down a little bit. And then we'll just drag select over the area here. We're going to do these one at a time. So I have just these vertices selected now. And then I'll hit S and then Y. And then scale those up. And we're essentially just trying to taper this a little bit. So we're going to scale this out just a little bit so that it matches the rounding of this a little bit closer. In this case, roughly 1.7. Rotate my viewport down again. Drag select over these vertices. And this will be the last one that we scale here for the bottom. So now I have just these selected. And then we'll hit S and then Y. Scale those up a little bit more as well. Now we don't want to scale them quite as much as the last one. We want to kind of have it because we want to create this kind of rounding curve here at the bottom. And then if we want to, we can select just the bottom half here. So we can select the bottom ones here because right now it kind of starts out flared and then it goes flat again. So maybe we will scale these at the bottom. Again, just the bottom ones, not the top one here. And we'll hit S and then Y. And scale that up even less than the last one. So it kind of goes down in the amount that we scale it each time. And we'll scale it out to about there. So now we can see that we've made this bottom half a lot more interesting. It's got this kind of wide flared base now. So it looks a little bit more sturdy. Now that we cleaned up the bottom, let's work on the outer edge. Right now the outer edge of this column is still pretty flat. So we're going to go up here to the very top. We can click off our model to deselect so we don't have anything selected. And then we're going to select this top vertex here. Now I know it's a little bit difficult to see, but we want this vertex here. So we have these kind of 4 small squares here at the top. We want the center left vertex selected. Okay, so we have that one selected. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And now for the rest of these, you want to hold down Shift because we want to add to this selection or the original one. So we'll hold down Shift and we're just selecting down this line. So we're just going all the way down the model here. Hold down Shift and then select each one, going all the way down to the very bottom. We don't need to select anything on the bottom. We don't need this. Okay, so now we have this line going from the very top of the column all the way down to the very bottom. And with those selected, now we're just going to move those over in the negative X direction just by grabbing them and moving them. We don't need to scale these at all. So we're just going to grab them using the move tool. And we're just going to move them out to the left. We don't need to move them very far because the further we move them out, the more pointed it gets. We just want to add a subtle curve to this side. So just a tiny amount. In this case, it was roughly negative 0.12 if you want to follow along a little bit more closely, or you can just eye it up. Okay, so the last thing we need to do here is we're going to drag select over all the very top of this column here. Because we can see right now it's got kind of a weird shape to it. It's also not particularly pointy. So we're going to drag select over every single vertex here at the top. And then we're going to hit the M key for merge. And we're going to choose merge at center. And when we do this, it's going to merge all of those points into one single vertex here. And it's going to make a nice sharp point at the top of this. So now instead of having, 6 or 7 or however many vertices there were at the top, we now just have a single vertex that comes to a nice sharp point. Now let's zoom out. And we're going to taper the middle of this column so it's not quite so wide here in the middle. So we're just going to drag select over the middle of this, the widest part of this column, right in the center. And then we can just hit S to start scaling it uniformly. And we're just going to make it a little bit smaller so that this taper is more of a sort of a normal cone shape. We can also do the same thing here at the top. I'm going to drag these, hit S, and then scale these in so that's more of a kind of conical sort of cone shape that we have now. So we're just making this shape a little bit more interesting, a little bit more complex, so it's not quite so blocky. With the general shape of our portal base completed, let's add some details to it. We're going to hit 2 to switch into our edge mode. And now you might notice that it already automatically basically selected the edges that you had selected last as vertices. However, if it didn't, that's fine. I'm just going to start with nothing selected. However, if you already had this edge here selected, you're good. Now that we're in our edge mode, I'm going to hold down Alt, and then I'm going to click on any one of these edges that go around the column. So I'm going to select this, and by holding Alt, it'll automatically select the entire contiguous loop that goes around the column. Now if I hold Alt and Shift, it'll do the same thing down here if I select this. And the reason I'm holding Shift is because I want to add to the selection. I don't want to keep losing it. And then lastly, we're going to go down here to the bottom, holding Alt and Shift. We're going to select this, and you'll notice it pretty much selects the entire thing, but it didn't get these last 2 edges. And that's mostly just because of how the geometry flows here, but luckily that's a relatively easy fix. So now we have all of this selected except for these last 2 edges. We can just hold down Shift, and we're just going to click on each of these edges to add them to the selection. So now I have all 3 rings going around these columns selected. With all 3 loops selected, we can hit Control and B to start beveling. And then once we start beveling, as we move our mouse, you'll see it starts kind of splitting those edges and making them into faces. Now while we're doing this, scroll up on your mouse wheel 1 time, and you'll see it adds a single cut. Every time you scroll up, it's going to add more cuts between them, but we only need a single cut. And just scale these, or move your mouse until they're about this large. We're going to be able to type in the exact value here, but just kind of pick an arbitrary size so that they're roughly as large as what you see here. Now we can go over here to the left side and we can actually type in a specific number. So for the width, I'm going to type in 0.025 and then hit enter. And then for our segments, if you forgot to add your segment, that's fine. You can set your segments here. In this case, we want 2. So that'll put a single cut right down the middle. With this bevel completed, we can now click off of our model to deselect all the edges. And then we're going to go through each one of these bevels that we made, and we're going to scale this inner loop inward to make kind of like 3 unique stones stacked on top of each other. It's essentially the look that we're going for. So let's go to the very top one. We can zoom in a little bit. And we're going to hold down Alt, and we want to select the edge that goes right through the middle of these 3 edges here. So just this central one, we want to leave the top 2 where they're at. And with that done, we can just hit S to scale, and we're going to scale this in just a little bit. We're essentially just making a little bit of an indent here to show that this stone, for this stone base that we're making, is separate from this. This is kind of like where the stones meet up, or where like the mortar of bricks would be, whatever you want to think of. We're basically just giving the impression that these are 2 separate stones. So now we can go down to this middle line. We can click off the model and make sure we have everything deselected, and then hold down Alt, and then click on this line here. So we're selecting the middle of this bevel, and then same thing, S to scale. And we're just going to scale it in roughly the same amount to give the impression that this is broken between 2 different stones. And then one last time, we're going to hold down Alt, click this here. And this time, because of the bevel, it's actually fixed this edge flow here. So we don't need to worry about selecting these 2. On the inside, it will have already selected them. They're considered part of the loop now. And then we can hit S, and then scale these in roughly the same amount. So now if we zoom out, we can look over here on the right side without all these lines overlapping, and we can see that this column now looks like it's made up of 3 unique stones stacked up on top of each other. With these breaks made in the stone, we're actually done with X-ray mode. So we can hit Alt and Z to exit our X-ray mode so that we can see the normal kind of opaque gray. And then before we go any further adding more details, we actually want to collapse in this mirror modifier, because now any details we add to this side will be symmetrically modeled over here on the right side, and we don't actually want that. We're going to be adding some chipping and some wear and tear, and we don't want the wear on this stone to be perfectly symmetrical. It's going to look kind of weird if it was. So we need to collapse this mirror modifier in and make it permanent. To make the mirror modifier permanent, first we need to leave our edit mode. So we're just going to hit tab to exit our edit mode. So we're back in object mode. We can go over here to our modifier panel, which is the little blue wrench icon. And we're going to select this mirror modifier. And we're going to go down to this little down arrow here, this little drop down, and then we can choose apply. So essentially all that's done is collapse this modifier, this mirror, and made it permanent on this model. So now any changes we make will no longer be perfectly mirrored on the other side. However, we've gotten all the use we needed out of that mirror modifier, so at this point we actually don't want the changes to be symmetrical. With the mirror modifier applied, we can now hit tab to go back into our edit mode, and then we can hit 1 to go into our vertex mode. Now that we're in our vertex mode, let's go down here to the bottom left. We're going to select this vertex here because it's not particularly close to anything else. So we're selecting this one here. And then we're going to hit Control and B to start beveling this vertex. However, you'll notice that it doesn't really do anything. And that's because by default, you can't really bevel a vertex. It's more meant for edges. However, if you hit V after hitting Control and B, now it allows you to bevel a vertex. So Control B, and then you have to hit V for vertex to start beveling a vertex. Now scroll down on your mouse wheel to remove the segment. See what we want, actually no segments at all on this. And this will allow us to bevel a vertex and kind of make like a wear and tear. So essentially what we're doing is we're chipping off the corner of this vertex. We're kind of breaking it off the stone. So we can move it to maybe about here. Again, this is more personal preference than anything. So we've now beveled this vertex and kind of cut that corner off. And then if we want to change the shape of this chip, we can select a new vertex here that we just created. And we're going to hit G for grab. And then we're going to hit it one more time. And that will bind it to only sliding along an edge that already existed. So it's kind of like sliding it here along one of these pre-existing edges. So maybe we slide it off to the right a little bit. And then that'll make the chip a little bit wider just on this side. And then maybe we could pull this side down. So we're going to hit G to start moving, but then we'll hit G again. So G twice. And then that'll allow it to be bound just to one of these edges. So again, like I said, this is essentially us kind of adding wear and tear to this model and kind of cutting off corners to give it a sort of chipped look. So we can select one of these vertex here that we just made again. Hit Control B to start beveling, and then V to enable the vertex bevel, and then maybe we bevel the top of this as well. So we're just making this chip here a little bit more complex. Now let's go around to another part of our model, maybe somewhere that's not quite so open. So we'll let's go on this side here. So I'm just going to select this vertex here, and then I'll hit Control B, then V. Now you have to be careful you're not moving it so far that you can see that one edge is actually clipping into the bottom. It's getting stuck down there. And that's going to create some overlapping vertices. We want to avoid that pretty much at all costs. So in order to make this chip bigger without clipping into that bottom edge there, we're going to chip it out as far as we can go. So let's say about there. And now we can select this top vertex here. And then we're just going to manually make this a bit wider. So maybe we'll hit G and then G again, and we'll move this chip up so that it's kind of cut into this little edge here. And maybe we'll make it wider to the left. So we're kind of cutting off this corner here, the edge of this column. So at this point, I'd like you to go around this model. So go around your entire base here, and just find areas here where you can kind of cut off corners and make it look like, somebody went through and maybe bumped into it with an axe or a warhammer or something, or it was part of a battle, or it's just been out in the weather and it's kind of been worn down over time. And I want you to just find some of these edges here and just kind of cut them off, wear them off, make these kind of chipped edges to give this a little bit more character on the bottom. Now you don't really have to worry about chipping the back side of your model, because we're really only going to be seeing it from the front for the purposes of this tutorial. If you decide you want to use this model later on and see the back side of it, you can always, go back and chip it later on, or you can take the time to do it now for practice. But for my purposes, I'm only going to be working on the front side of this model because that's all we're really going to see. So again, you'll be using Control B, then V to start beveling that vertex, and then G again to slide individual parts of those vertexes that you just created to make your chips a different size. I'll see you in just a moment when I've finished chipping my model. So I've finished placing all the chips on my portal base, but there's a small issue on mine that you might have also ran into as well. So if I zoom in down here to this chip, you'll notice that the model actually kind of acts a little weird here. There's no edge connecting across for these vertices here, and yet it looks like there should be. And that's because of the way we stretch the model out. It's actually kind of sort of breaking the geometry here. It's trying to do something that this wouldn't normally be able to do. Now luckily it's relatively easy to fix this. We're going to use a tool called Knife in order to fix this. So to access your Knife tool, we're going to hit K on our keyboard for Knife. And then we can go down here and this will bring up our Knife tool. We can hover over any one of these vertices and you can see it turns into a green square. So we're going to hover over the bottom portion of this. Now in your particular situation, you're going to have to look exactly what the shape of your chip is like. But for my vertex here, for my chip rather, I'm going to select over this bottom vertex. And we're basically just going to be cutting this chip in half. So now that I've selected one of these vertices, I can choose to cut across this chip. So I want to cut this chip in half. So be it from this direction to this direction, or across the shorter direction this way. Usually you want to cut across the shorter direction of your chip. So in my case, that's this way. So with our first one selected, I can just select the vertex that's directly across, and I want to make sure that it snaps to that. You can see it kind of magnetizes to it, and it turns into a square when it's over there. So I'll click, and now we can see that it's created a line here, but it actually hasn't changed anything yet. And that's because we need to hit spacebar to confirm this change. So we're just going to hit space, and that will confirm the cut we just placed. And we can see now that if we zoom around this chip, it actually cuts inward to the model rather than having that weird kind of broken bridged edge that goes across. So now we have a nice sort of divot in our model, and that's because we cut it in half. We gave it some more geometry to work with, so it knows better how to display this cut. Let's add one last effect to finish off this portal base. We're going to be adding a bevel modifier. We're going to be adding a bevel modifier that will add a soft rounding to all the edges on our model. This will give it a sort of plastic toy look later on when we apply textures. So with our model still selected, it doesn't matter whether or not you're in edit mode or in object mode for this. We can go over here to our modifier panel, the little blue wrench icon. We'll choose add modifier. We'll go to the second column here and then choose bevel. So essentially what this bevel modifier is doing is it's a kind of non-destructive way to add rounding to all the edges on our model based on some parameters that we set. So this wouldn't be a good thing for, adding the chips like we did because those are very sporadic and kind of all over the place. They're a little bit more random. So the bevel modifier is going to take a very even, normal sort of uniform approach across the entire model, and it's just going to be rounding out all of these edges. So we can see here that it's added a kind of chamfer, a rounding, a bevel to all the edges on our model. So let's hit Tab to exit our edit mode so it's a little bit easier to visualize what this is doing. And now we can see that it's added this kind of cut on all these edges to round them out. Let's change some of the settings here on the modifier to make it look a little bit nicer. First, let's set the size here. We're going to change this to 0.006 for the amount. So we're making a really tiny bevel around here. We don't want these bevels so large that they intersect with each other, because then we'll start getting weird overlaps on our model. So it's better to keep this amount pretty small. We're going to set our segments here to 2. So we want to have 2 cuts in this. If we had it set to 1, it just makes all these flat bevels everywhere. So we'll have it set to 2. We're going to change the angle for this limit method. Right now it's only looking for edges that are 30 degrees or more. In our case, we want to set it down to 0, so it's looking for every edge essentially. So anything that's higher than 0 is going to be beveled in our case. So it's adding in some of these edges that it was missing before. Now let's twirl open the geometry section, and we're going to uncheck clamp overlap. And this will get rid of some of the areas where it's kind of gotten rid of the bevel because it thinks it was going to overlap, even though the overlap is so minor that we won't even see it. So by turning off clamp overlap, we're allowing it to bevel every single edge across the model, whether or not it thinks that there's going to be some overlapping issues or not. And then lastly, we're going to twirl down shading, and we're going to check on harden normals. So we're not going to notice a whole lot of changes here immediately. You might notice some spots where it changes, but essentially what harden normals being checked on is doing is it's making sure anything that looks flat remains looking flat. It's going to prevent these areas that we want to stay looking flat from having this kind of weird rounding and bowing to it. You'll notice, however, when we enable this, we do get this little warning up here, and it's kind of cut off. I guess I can make mine a little bit larger here for you. And it says enable auto smooth in object data properties. And that's in order for the harden normals to actually be visible. So we're going to do that now. We'll go down here to this object data properties section for this model that we have selected now. It's this little green triangle. We can twirl open normals, and then we're going to check on auto smooth. So auto smooth by default is just going to look at the entire model. It's going to smooth out the edges based on some parameter that we have set here. In this case, 30 degrees. So it's going to look for all these edges that are over 30 degrees or within 30 degrees of each other, and it's going to try to smooth them together. So we can see by turning it on and off, these little rounding that we added that right now looks kind of jagged and blocky. When we turn this on, it makes it look nice and smooth. This is also where the harden normals comes into play. That's because it's preventing this auto smooth from making these flat faces here smooth together. So it's keeping them nice and flat and more faceted looking, which helps the look of this model. It gives it kind of a carved and cut out of stone, like stonework look that we're going for. And that's it. We've finished modeling the most complicated portion of this entire project. You might have noticed that this episode is a bit longer, but that's because there was a lot to cover and a lot of things to teach you about like the anatomy of the model, as well as just this relatively complex, somewhat difficult to explain shape, as well as all the rounding that we added. So hopefully at this point you feel a little bit more confident adjusting and manipulating a mesh into a more complex shape such as this. In the next episode, we'll be making the floating stones that surround the top of our portal. We'll also add some remaining details like glowing runes and broken cobblestones on the ground. I'll see you there. Don't forget to click the link in the description and comments below for a free month of Skillshare. Watch my classes as well as thousands of others across a wide variety of topics. For the sake of transparency, I do receive a small amount of money if you decide to continue your subscription after that first free month. I truly appreciate the support. If you're enjoying the tutorial series so far, like the video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're notified when I release new content just like this.